On April 30th, 2026, at exactly 6:47 p.m., the state of Texas strapped a 37-year-old black man to a gurney, pumped a fatal dose of pentobarbital into his veins, and pronounced him dead 21 minutes later. And the entire time, his brand-new wife, a 31-year-old British woman named Tiana Krasniqi, was pressed against the glass of the death chamber, arms stretched wide, screaming, "I love you," as she watched his lips turn blue. They had been married for exactly 16 days. Now here is what I need you to stay with me for. Because this case is not just about what happened in that execution chamber. It is about a man who may have confessed to murders he did not commit. It is about rap lyrics that were used to send a black man to death row. It is about a cousin who held a secret for 17 years and finally broke. And it is about a system that looked at all of that evidence and still pulled the trigger anyway. What we are about to get into is going to make you question everything you think you know about justice in this country. Stay with me. Before we get to James Broadnax, I need you to know who was lost on June 26, 2008. Stephen Swan was 26 years old. Matthew Butler was 28. They were Christian music producers, men of faith who spent their days making music that meant something. Matthew had 2 small children at home. They were working a late session at Matthew's recording studio in Garland, Texas, a suburb just outside of Dallas. That night, 2 young cousins, James Broadnax and Demarius Cummings, both high on PCP-laced marijuana, came into that parking lot looking to rob someone. They were broke, they were reckless, and they targeted 2 men who had no idea what was coming. The robbery went sideways. Both Stephen and Matthew were shot and killed in that parking lot. The cousins took off in Stephen Swan's Crown Victoria and were arrested 170 miles away. 2 families were shattered that night. Teresa Butler lost her son. John Swan lost hers. That pain is real, it is documented, and it has never gone away. Matthew's mother would later tell the court, "Let this execution proceed." And I want you to hold on to that grief, because it matters. The victims in this story deserve to be seen as the full human beings they were, not just footnotes. Here is where this case starts to fracture. After Broadnax and Cummings were arrested and brought back to Garland, Broadnax, still under the influence of PCP, gave not 1 but 2 on-camera jailhouse interviews to local news reporters. He bragged about the killings. He said he had nothing to live for. He said, and I want to be clear, this is a quote from those interviews, that he pulled the trigger. Those interviews destroyed him in court. But here is what his legal team spent years trying to tell anyone who would listen. James Broadnax was 19 years old, suicidal, and high on PCP when he gave those interviews. A man who grew up with documented childhood abuse, physical and sexual, who by his own account did not care whether he lived or died. His attorneys argued that he confessed not because he was the shooter, but because he wanted to protect his cousin, whose criminal record was far more extensive, and because in that moment, he genuinely did not care about his own life. The courts heard that argument and kept moving. Now here is the forensic layer of this case that should have stopped everything. When investigators processed the murder weapon, they found DNA on the trigger grip. They found DNA in the pocket of one of the victims. None of it belonged to James Broadnax. All of it belonged to his cousin, Demarius Cummings. Let that sit for a second. The man on death row, his DNA was not on the gun. The man serving life without parole, his DNA was on the gun and on the victim. Broadnax's attorneys filed this in their final Supreme Court appeals. They argued that the DNA evidence directly corroborated a bombshell that dropped in March of 2026, When Demarius Cummings, after 17 years of silence, signed a sworn affidavit and recorded a video confession from inside prison. In his own words, Cummings said, "It's just been weighing on me. James has been telling my story this whole time. I'm here to come forward and tell it how it's supposed to be told, that it was me, that I was the killer." 17 years. He waited 17 years, and he only came forward when he learned his cousin had an execution date. The Texas Attorney General's office called it questionable new evidence. The victims' families called it a lie and a stall tactic. The Supreme Court declined to intervene, and so the execution proceeded. I need to talk about something that does not get nearly enough attention in this case, because it speaks to a much larger pattern that is destroying black men in courtrooms all across this country. During the sentencing phase of Broadnax's trial in 2009, prosecutors did not just argue about the night of the murders. They introduced 40 pages of handwritten rap lyrics that Broadnax had in his car at the time of his arrest. They called it gangsta rap. They told the jury it was a window into his violent mentality. They argued it proved he would kill again. 40 pages of poetry used to send a man to death row. Broadnax's attorneys, along with major recording artists including Travis Scott, T.I., and Killer Mike, who all filed briefs at the Supreme Court, argued that using rap lyrics as autobiographical evidence is a practice that targets young black men specifically. No other art form is treated this way in a courtroom. No prosecutor introduces a country song about heartbreak as evidence that a white defendant is emotionally unstable. No one reads a crime novelist's thriller chapter to a jury to prove the author is violent. But rap lyrics from a 19-year-old black man? Those go in front of a jury at the sentencing phase of a death penalty case. As Killer Mike wrote in a public statement, "Across this country, rap lyrics are used to open investigations, to charge suspects, to secure convictions, and to argue for the death penalty. No other fictional form is targeted like this." The nearly all-white jury that sentenced James Broadnax to death never heard an instruction from the judge telling them not to read those lyrics as autobiography. They read them as truth. I want to take a moment to talk about Tiana Krasniqi, because her story inside this story is one of the most layered things I have come across in a long time. Tiana is 31 years old. She grew up in Lewisham, southeast London. She enrolled in a master's degree in international human rights law at the University of Law, and she chose to research racial disparities in the American death penalty system for her dissertation. She emailed James Broadnax as a case study. He wrote back. And within months, she told friends that something had shifted, that what started as research had become something else entirely. She relocated from London to Houston, Texas. She assembled a legal team. She was on the phone with attorneys, filing appeals, doing media, advocating in the final weeks before the execution date. And on April 14th, 2026, 16 days before he was killed, she married him in a 20-minute ceremony behind a glass partition at the Allen B. Polunsky unit in Texas. On the day of the execution, she stood in that viewing room. She pressed her arms against the glass. She watched the IV go into his arm. She watched him groan and drop his head. She watched his lips go blue. She was screaming, "I love you," and "Open your eyes," until she had to be helped out of the building. After his death, she wrote on social media, "They killed my husband. My husband suffered so bad from the lethal injection that he had a nosebleed and bruising on his neck." And then she said, "You killed Mr. Broadnax. Gee, but you ain't killed Mrs. Broadnax." She is still fighting. The fight did not end in that chamber. James Broadnax was pronounced dead at 6:47 p.m. on April 30th, 2026. He was 37 years old. He became the third person executed in Texas that year. In his final statement, he said, "To the family, I prayed for years that any of my choices would create heaviness in your heart and burdens on your spirits. I prayed to God for your forgiveness. Despite what you think about me, I hope to God that prayer was answered. But no matter what you think about me, Texas got it wrong." Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler deserved justice. Their families deserved closure. Whether James Broadnax was the one who pulled that trigger, that question, and thanks to 17 years of silence and a system that moved faster than the truth could, may never be fully resolved. What we are left with is this: a man executed on the basis of a drug-induced confession, rap lyrics read as autobiography, a nearly all-white jury, and DNA evidence that pointed to someone else. And somewhere in Houston tonight, a 31-year-old British woman who married a man on death row is keeping her word. I want to know what you think about one specific thing. When a cousin, whose DNA is on the murder weapon, signs a sworn confession and records a video saying he was the one who pulled the trigger, at what point does that become enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And make sure you are subscribed with the bell on, because as new developments come out in this case, you will be the first to know. We are not done here.